Hello, everyone. My name is Christian, and I'm here today with Julia McClure. I'm one of the editors of a book called Talking About Global Inequality, which will come out sometime soon. And we're so pleased and glad that Julia is one of the contributors to our book. Julia is a lecturer in late medieval and early modern global history at Glasgow University. And she's also the founder of the Poverty Research Network. And Julia, I was just rereading the contribution to our book, and I really think it's so fascinating. And one of the things which I think coming out from your perspective is this idea of taking a kind of longer term historical view, and also really taking on a global history lens on trying to understand how and why the world is so unequal as it is today. So I was wondering whether you'd maybe say a bit more about what are we gaining from this long-term perspectives.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Christian, for this question. So I run a master's course here at the University of Glasgow on the global history of inequalities. And this is one of the questions we debate in class also with the master's students. And we see that trends in global inequality accelerated from the 1945 and again from the 1970s. And this was driven very much by the development of the political economic ideology of neoliberalism. The resulting politics of economic governance set the pathways for the exponential development of the economic inequalities that define the contemporary world. And so one could take the position that the financial logic of the post-1945 contours of inequality are distinct, and therefore we should focus inequality studies really on this post-1945 period. But I've always taken the position, somewhat unsurprisingly for an historian of the late Middle Ages and early modern period, that deeper historical analysis is needed to understand the complexities of structural inequalities. Now, there are a number of different ways in which longue durée perspectives matter to the understanding of global inequality. But the one that I'd particularly emphasize is that lengthening our historical perspective puts the imperial origins of global inequality into the picture. Global inequality was seen as something that occurred almost naturally as certain countries developed economically faster than others as the result of endogenous factors such as better natural resources, institutions, or technical innovations. And the global historical turn really challenged this approach to understandings of global inequality and aimed to move away from these notions of civilizational superiority that they promoted that were inherent in some of these earlier approaches to thinking about global inequality. And so longue durée global historical perspectives demonstrate that global inequality should be seen really as the product of global imperialism. Put very simply, wealth accumulated in the so-called global north due to the way that it was appropriated in the so-called global south. So in another recent volume that I've recently co-edited with Gurminder Bambra, Imperial Inequalities, the Politics of Economic Governance Across European Empires, we explore how nation states and empires were co-constitutive units, how imperial extraction through taxation established pathways for global inequalities, and how many of these economic pathways to global inequality continued after the political project of decolonization. So in my own work, as you know, I've focused upon the development of colonial capitalism as a world system in the long 16th century. When Europeans arrived in the Americas at the end of the 15th century, they already carried with them the ideological foundations for what would become colonial capitalism. They were not driven by curiosity, but the desire for capital gain. Columbus arrived in the Americas heavily indebted and was desperate to locate commodity sources to make an economic return on capital that had been invested in to make his venture possible. Disappointed by the lack of obvious sources of lucrative spices or precious metals, he enslaved some indigenous Taino people. And while the Spanish monarchs ruled not long after that the enslavement of these people was illegal, this did not prevent the enslavement of indigenous people, and the ruling against slavery never applied to African people. And so increasingly racialized labor regimes and the pursuit of profit would become key facets of the colonial capitalist world system. So for me, understanding these imperial origins of global inequality is not simply to calculate the economic gains made through coerced extraction, but to understand how imperialism laid the ideological foundations and political economic institutions that have set the pathway dependencies for the productions and reproductions of global inequalities. So, for example, Europeans were developing a particular conception of the natural world, not as part of a multi-species ecological matrix of which humans were part, but as a potential source of commodities and something to be mastered. The resulting ecological impacts of imperialism resulting from this particular ideology continue to shape the climate change which reinforces global inequalities today. Europeans also started to conceptualize proto-racial hierarchies, which shaped global forced labor regimes and have hardwired the racial dimensions of global inequalities. Other ways in which imperialism structured global inequality have been explained by world systems theorists, such as the ways in which colonial economies were orientated towards the production of cash crops, raw commodities that were often developed elsewhere. Increased understanding of environmental history and climate change highlights how these orientation of colonial economies towards certain modes of production has long-term climatic effects, such as desertification, which perpetuates imperial inequalities even after so-called periods of decolonization. So, in short, I argue that we need to lengthen our understanding of global inequality to understand its imperial origins and to understand the ideological, racial, and environmental dimensions of this global inequality.
Thank you so much, Julia. That's just really interesting to hear about. It kind of brings me to want to ask just one follow-up question, because I know that one of the things which I think is really fascinating about your work is, on the one hand, you're working with global history and with early modern history and with the history of empires, etc. But I also know that you've been working on indigenous communities in the present. So I was wondering how, for you, do you also see these kind of long-term impacts on indigenous communities today? I mean, you've mentioned now, for example, the effects upon the environment, but for the indigenous communities that you've been working with, would you say that there's kind of these long-term impacts, if you will, on their conditions?
Absolutely. So you mentioned that I'm part of this poverty research network, but I'm also part of a food sovereignty network. And we've been working with indigenous communities and peasant communities in the south of Mexico on looking at their agroecological mode of production, particularly the milpa system in the area of Mexico that was part of the Maya Empire, is now the Maya region of southern Mexico. And I would argue that there's still a kind of ideological battle taking place today around the appropriate form of agricultural production. And so this, really starts in the 16th century, when you have the imposition of a certain increasingly capitalized mode of agricultural production, taking the form of monocrop agriculture, orientating towards cash crops. And this form of agriculture becomes very dependent on nitrate-rich fertilizers as soils become increasingly depleted. And this was a kind of economic but also ideological system that is expanding across indigenous territories through colonialism. And it was contrary to the indigenous forms of agroecological production that existed across the Americas prior to the expansion of colonial capitalism. And this ideological battle for a certain mode of production, and also for a certain reproduction of society, community, and ecology, is still at the forefront of neo-colonial struggles today, neoliberal struggles today, and also questions about climate change and appropriate responses to climate change today. And so I think that understanding these alternative forms of agroecology is really important to decolonizing and decarbonizing and thinking about the kind of decolonial approaches to solutions to today's global inequality.
Thank you so much, Julia, for offering us of these insights into your work and into also to the contribution that you've made to our book, Talking About Global Inequality. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you very much.